Christina Baker Kline is an acclaimed novelist, nonfiction writer, and editor. All of her books explore how people tell the stories of their lives and what these stories reveal about who we are. She explores often overlooked stories and long-kept secrets that can many times define our lives but are beyond our control. Her most recent book, Orphan Train, a New York Times bestseller, #1 on the independent booksellers list, and the #1 book club pick in the nation, is a specifically American story of mobility and rootlessness, highlighting a little-known but historically significant moment in our country's past. The book chronicles the journey faced by thousands of orphans living in large cities on the East Coast who are placed on trains and sent to the West Coast for adoption. This fascinating story is truly a page-turner. We are so excited to have Christina Baker Kline here tonight.
It's a tremendous honor to be here. I am privileged to be with these writers. I'm so grateful to President and Mrs. Bush for having me, and I'm struck as I was listening and watching the incredible video, how the themes in my novel are resonant in this whole exciting evening and organization. What sets the story in motion is that a 17-year-old girl in foster care who has been abused and mistreated loves to read. And the only way she can get a book is that she steals a book from the library. And in doing so, she puts herself in the position where she has to do community service. And so she goes to work for this old woman on the coast of Maine who seems to have nothing in common with her. She lives in a mansion and she's 91 and she seems wealthy and quite remote. But over the course of working with her and unpacking boxes in her attic, she discovers the story of the Orphan Trains. And this story propels her to find answers in her own life. So that's the story of my novel, but I want to take you on a journey of the research I did very quickly. But I stumbled on this incredible story 10 years ago. This rather quirky-looking child is my son, Hayden. He was 8 years old when this photo was taken. He's now a freshman in college. But here he is playing the piano in a pirate costume, which tells you something about who he is. And we happened to be visiting my in-laws in Fargo, North Dakota for the holidays, which, if you've ever been to Fargo for the holidays, you know means that you'll be stuck inside in a blizzard. And on the third day, my mother-in-law, in pure desperation, pulled out a book. It's called Century of Stories. It's a centennial celebration of the very tiny town of Jamestown, North Dakota, which is where she grew up. Truth be told, my mother-in-law had barely looked through the book. She had gotten it and stuck it on a shelf. It was filled with newspaper articles. But because my 3 children were running around screaming, she decided that she needed to entertain them somehow, so she pulled it out, and they stumbled on this story. They called it Orphan Train, and it proved there was a home for many children on the prairie. But the incredible thing was, this man on the left is her father. And the other man is her uncle. And their 3 sisters were also featured in this story about the train riders. And the amazing thing is that she had never heard of it. She knew nothing. She never knew that train riders had come to Jamestown, North Dakota. She never knew that her father had been orphaned and had been put on a train. And the amazing thing to me as the mother of 3 sons is not that the boys didn't tell. You know, boys keep secrets. But the 3 sisters, I'm one of 4 girls, and I just cannot imagine that they all lived in this town for all of those years and she never heard the story. But it was true. So, as I say, it was a decade ago, and I was flabbergasted. My husband was a history major. At Yale, you think maybe He would have heard something about this, if not from his family history, at least at college. But he had never heard of it either. And so it set me on a journey. I was working on some other books, so I was doing those. But over the intervening 7 years, I started throwing things into a file. And I came to realize that the story of the Orphan Trains has been hidden in plain sight. And it's a huge story. Between 1854 and 1929, more than 200,000 children were sent on trains from the East Coast, mostly from Grand Central Station, to points in the Midwest, and then all over the country. It's the largest single migration of children in our nation's history, and it was a work program. So 3 years ago, I took up the subject again in earnest, and I started doing more in-depth research. And here's what I found. In 1854, there were about 30,000 children living on the streets of New York. They were homeless. The term orphan train is a bit of a misnomer. Only about 30% of the children were orphaned. The others were abandoned, they were runaways, they were literally picked off the street, and they were taken out of homes. The orphanages were so overrun that the Children's Aid Society, which is one of the biggest orphanages in New York, would house children in the jail when they ran out of room, which you can imagine was not a particularly good place for them to be. And this is a picture from the Lower East Side at the time that I'm writing about. Children, as I said, had nowhere to go. Many of them never learned to read. They came with immigrant families, and if something happened to a parent, these children often just fell between the cracks. So they would end up on the streets. This little girl is taking care of her younger sister, which was very common for girls of that age, and I write about that in the book. This little boy is a bootblack. Bootblacks and newsies were the two most common jobs for children. And you have to remember, at this time, there were no social programs of any kind. There was no welfare, there was no foster care. Children were property, and poor children, pure and simple, were labor. I love this picture because I think these two children look like they're about 40 years old, don't they? They're selling newspapers, and they've been organized by gangs, which is how it worked. You would sell newspapers for a penny, but the children really got very little money. Children slept wherever they could on the streets. They slept on fire escapes. They slept on grates. And so this Methodist minister named Charles Loring Brace came up with the idea that he would send children on trains. He had a kind of idealized fresh air fun thought. He thought, let's send these poor children, these destitute children from the streets of New York to bucolic farmland. He sort of imagined, sheep dotting the meadows and white farmhouses with wraparound porches and red barns, and a way for to get these children just off the streets and gone. And he wasn't so far off, and some of the children actually ended up having quite wonderful experiences. But as you might imagine, the transition was often very rocky. These were immigrant children. They went into small conservative communities in the Midwest where people looked the same. Many of these children looked very different. They were from Jewish and Italian and Polish and, God forbid, Irish families. They were not all Protestant. In fact, very few of them were. And especially the older children, because the trains were 2 to 14 years old, the older children had often been on the streets for a long time, and they were somewhat wily and manipulative, and they weren't really used to being with a family. This is one of the only known pictures of a group of children on the trains. Most of the trains held 10 to 30 children. This one is a bit larger, but I recently stumbled on this amazing photograph, which is of children in North Dakota. This is a more representative size of the train. So, as you might imagine, given that it was a work program, the most popular children, yes, boys, between the ages of 9 and 14, because of course, they could work on the farm, they could live in the barn. Even though you were supposed to send the children to school, they often didn't go, and particularly the boys, which just meant more time for them to work. The second most popular group, of course, babies. Trains of all babies were called mercy trains. These are some typical posters. So the one that I talk about in the book, which is actually a real poster, begins, "A company of homeless children having been thrown friendless upon the world," which I just think is such an interesting and chilling way to put it. The children would get out and line up by height at a train station. There was no screening process, so anyone could choose a child. And even though the children could, there were volunteers in the communities who could sort of, if something happened, they could go in. Remember that children were property, so they usually weren't believed. The people who took them in were more often believed. This is quite an amazing map to me because this shows you that they went all over the United States. They often went on trains from the Midwest to other places. And as you can see, quite a few went to Texas. By the way, this map is extremely partial. Record keeping was so spotty, birth certificates of these children were often destroyed, altered, or locked up. It wasn't until the descendants got involved and started getting them to open the vaults at the Children's Aid Society and the Foundling Hospital. Actually, it wasn't until the descendants became lawyers that things started to change. Okay, so I'm going to end with this little anecdote. As I mentioned, the Irish were quite terribly discriminated against. You may know about that. No Irish need apply were signs in New York at the time. But even worse than being Irish was being a redhead. So this is an article from the New York Times in 1901, "Foundlings Find Homes, Children from a Catholic Asylum Taken West, No Redheads Among Them." So it says no redheaded children or children with freckles were among these children. Redheads, especially those with freckles, are not easily placed in homes, and this is the part I love, especially even if their hair is of Titian and the freckles beauty spots. So they ask the traveling agent why redheads aren't wanted, and he says he's inquired all over the United States, and he has invariably been told that redheaded children fought too much and had bad tempers generally. He does not agree with this verdict, but finds it difficult to defeat a tradition that has stood for many generations. So these are my two oldest children. Hayden, that child that you saw earlier, is the one in the black t-shirt, and Will, who's heading off to college this fall, is in the white. So you can see that I had quite a personal reason for making my character an Irish girl with red hair, and a personal stake in this whole story, not just that my husband's grandfather rode on a train, but also that I have these redheaded children. So this is a picture that is delightful to me. When I started the book just over 3 years ago, there were 150 living train riders, all between about 90 and 100 years old. Today, there are fewer than 20. And I was privileged to do this book in a moment when I got to speak to 7 living train riders, to go to 4 train rider reunions, to interview them and to hear their stories in person. And I have to say, it's been a privilege to work on this story, and it's been a privilege to be here tonight. So these are some train riders. Thank you so much.